How Uber lost China. Imagine a company spending roughly $2 billion over 2 years, fighting tooth and nail to win the largest ride-hailing market in the world, and ultimately losing. At first glance, that sounds like a clear-cut major failure. But Uber's story in China has an interesting twist, because it turns out this seemingly obvious defeat ended up turning into something far more profitable than most people would assume. In this video, we're breaking down how the fierce battle between Uber and Didi in China played out, from a massive subsidy war to a final deal that turned this defeat narrative into something far more complex and interesting to analyze. In 2013, Uber quietly began testing operations in China. Interestingly, Uber's CEO at the time, Travis Kalanick, personally oversaw the driver sign-up process during these early stages. This shows just how seriously Uber viewed the opportunity in the Chinese market, a market with such a massive population and extremely promising transportation demand potential. This quiet testing phase lasted for a couple of years, before Uber eventually launched a full-scale expansion into China in 2015. The CEO's direct involvement in details, as small as driver signups, shows that China wasn't just another ordinary additional market for Uber. It was viewed as strategic enough that the company's top leader personally oversaw the process himself. When Uber launched at full scale, they were backed by an investment from Baidu, one of China's tech giants, along with mapping technology superior to their local competitors. This combination of advantages helped Uber's China launch capture around 30% market share fairly quickly. But there was one other key factor that helped this early success: timing. Uber entered at a moment when their main competitor, Didi, was distracted by a merger process with Didi, another local competitor. This momentum created a fairly significant window of opportunity for Uber to enter and immediately grab a substantial chunk of market share, before Didi could fully refocus on defending its dominance. Even though Uber managed a fairly impressive early start, it's important to understand that Didi wasn't just any ordinary competitor. Didi already had extremely deep roots in the Chinese market, having started in Beijing back in 2012, well before Uber even launched at full scale in the country. After the merger with Kuaidi was completed in 2015, Didi grew into a giant with roughly 250 million registered users, controlling around 80% of China's ride-hailing market. That's an enormous scale, reflecting just how deep Didi's penetration was in its own domestic market. So even though Uber managed to steal a good early start through Didi's moment of distraction, they were actually challenging a competitor that already had a far more solid foundation and a much larger user base than they did. This rivalry then escalated into an all-out subsidy war between the two companies. Didi managed to raise $7 billion, while Uber raised $3.5 billion from Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. Both sides poured this massive funding into subsidizing ride fares, even to the point of operating at a loss, just to win over riders and drivers in this market. This is a classic strategy in tech startup wars. Whoever has more capital and can outlast the other in a subsidy battle has the potential to win the market in the long run. But this strategy also created an extremely expensive and unsustainable situation for both sides, given the scale of funds that had to keep flowing just to maintain each company's position in this highly price-sensitive market. In a price-sensitive market like China, Uber reportedly spent around $1 billion every single year just to hold on to 20% market share. Even more striking, Uber never once turned a profit in a single city in China throughout its entire time operating there. Just imagine the scale of this spending: $1 billion per year just to hold on to a fifth of the market without ever reaching profitability in any city. This paints an extremely clear picture of just how expensive it was to simply survive in a market dominated by a far more deeply rooted local competitor, in a subsidy war that showed no signs of stopping. By summer 2016, the gap between the two companies had become very clear. Didi claimed roughly 85% market share, while operating in about 400 cities across China. By comparison, Uber was only present in around 100 cities. This gap wasn't just about market share alone, but also about the scale of geographic reach. Didi was already far more widespread and deeply entrenched across various Chinese cities, while Uber remained limited to a small fraction of the total number of cities. These numbers painted an increasingly clear picture. This battle was leaning heavily toward a Didi victory, and the early window of opportunity Uber had exploited was narrowing further as time went on. Travis Kalanick himself eventually admitted that Uber was losing roughly $1 billion per year in China. Internal sources also indicated that the company had burned through roughly $2 billion over 2 years, in an effort to hold their ground against Didi on a battlefield that was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. This direct admission from the CEO is fairly significant. It wasn't just speculation from outside analysts, but direct confirmation from the person who understood the company's internal financial situation best. These figures paint a picture of losses that were genuinely massive, even for a company as large as Uber. On August 1, 2016, Didi announced it would acquire Uber's entire China operation, absorbing its brand, business, and data in their entirety. As part of this deal, Uber received roughly 5.89% direct equity in the newly combined company, plus economic rights equal to 17.7% of Didi's benefits. As part of this broader deal, Didi also invested $1 billion into Uber globally, while valuing the combined ride-hailing giant at $35 billion. Fairly notably, Kalanick and Didi founder Chung Wei even joined each other's boards as part of this deal, a sign that the relationship between these two companies, despite having been extremely competitive before, ultimately ended in a form of strategic collaboration. Many critics frame this deal as a defeat for Uber, since they never managed to conquer the world's largest ride-hailing market directly. But if we look deeper into the numbers, the story is far more complex than a simple defeat narrative. The roughly $2 billion Uber had spent chasing the Chinese market ended up being worth close to $7 billion in Didi equity they received as part of this deal. This is an extremely important detail to understand. Uber didn't simply lose and walk away empty-handed. They converted operational losses that had been steadily draining their funds into a strategic equity stake in the competitor that had actually won the market battle. Instead of continuing to burn cash endlessly in a war that was becoming increasingly unwinnable, they took an exit that potentially delivered far greater long-term financial value. The decision to retreat from China also allowed Uber to redirect their capital and attention toward other still promising markets, like India, as well as toward autonomous vehicle research, an area with the potential to become the long-term future of the transportation industry as a whole. In other words, what looked at first glance like surrender actually turned into a well-calculated strategic exit. Instead of continuing to endlessly drain resources into a market that was becoming increasingly difficult to win, Uber chose to realize the value of their investment, while freeing up capital and focus for other opportunities that might have better long-term prospects. So what's the big lesson we can take from the story of Uber versus Didi in China? A massive subsidy war in an extremely price-sensitive market against a local competitor that already had far deeper roots and much larger scale turned out to be extremely expensive to sustain, even for a company as large as Uber. Spending billions of dollars just to hold on to minority market share without ever reaching profitability is clearly not a sustainable situation in the long run. But this story also teaches something more nuanced. Sometimes knowing when to retreat from a battle that's becoming increasingly unwinnable and converting losses into a strategic asset can be a far smarter decision than fighting to the last dollar. Uber didn't win in China in the traditional sense. They never dominated this market, but they also didn't fully lose because they managed to turn operational losses into a strategic equity stake worth far more than the total amount they had spent. This story serves as an important reminder that in business, winning and losing aren't always as simple as who controls the largest market share. Sometimes, a well-calculated decision to retreat can create far more value than continuing to force your way through a battlefield that's already become increasingly difficult to win. If you enjoy tech business case studies like this, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss other case studies on global business successes and failures. See you in the next video.